Is the lighthouse meant to be taken literally, or is it a symbolic mind? I'm Jonathan Hetterly. This is Psych Cinema. In today's episode, I'm going to explore the lighthouse with 3 psychological principles. We're going to look at Freudian repression and some of the defense mechanisms employed by the 2 characters. We're going to explore isolation and how disconnect from society tends to lead people towards madness. And then we're going to wrap it up with the psychology of indoctrination, brainwashing, and subliminal messages that help suggest people see things that really are an inception from somebody else's thoughts. But before we get started, do me a favor, subscribe to our channel so you'll get notified anytime we drop new content. Now, I already did a review of The Lighthouse that you can find here. Essentially, I greatly respect this movie. There's a lot to digest and think about. I don't know if I'd use the word enjoy. I don't know if I would recommend this movie to everybody, but those that love film and cinema, they're gonna find something rewarding out of this movie. Now, there's a lot of ways to interpret this movie, and I looked online. There's a lot of people explaining what the ending meant to them, and there's even some suggestions that this is a literal take or it's informed and inspired by 2 different lighthouse tragedies, real-life stories. There's also a lot of Greek mythology as a Greek morality tale having to do with Proteus and Prometheus. I'm not so interested in explaining that. There's other great videos out there for you to explore. I'm more interested in the psychological concepts found in this film. In a lot of ways, this movie is very rich because it allows you open interpretation of what really happened and what does it all mean. And so if we want to really look at the unconscious, the subconscious, and the more symbolic or surreal, we got to start with Sigmund Freud. That's right, Mr. Penis himself, because everything about Freud was about sex, right? And this movie is heavy-handed with sexual imagery and sexual metaphor. When we think about sexual repression, Freud basically said all of our dysfunction in life goes back to some type of sexual maturation or sexual dysfunction, whether it has to do with your relationship with your mother, with your father, whether it be that you're not getting enough sex. Everything for Freud was about sex. And as you watch this movie, you start to say, okay, is this just really a Freudian mind? Because everything based upon even the lighthouse in its phallic symbolism, whether it be the mermaid in terms of isolation, someone starts to masturbate with a figurine that turns into a real life character. It's all about sex, right? And you have these 2 men that are isolated just with each other without a larger society and civilization that they conform their behaviors. Do they just revert to these primal sexual urges? And if that's the case, then maybe Freud was onto something. Maybe some things really do come down to sex. So when we think about repression, repression is an unconscious mechanism employed by the ego to keep disturbing or threatening thoughts from being conscious. And so in a lot of ways, the whole experience of this film for the 2 innkeepers or wikis is completely miserable. They're isolated, they're cut off, they really are not a good pair themselves. It's a lot of physical labor. The living quarters in space is so claustrophobic and condensed, and even the way that the film is shot in a square ratio suggests how cramped they are or how isolated they are. The natural elements are really punishing to where they look miserable. So again, with all of this negativity all around their life, are they looking for some type of positive outlet or expression in some ways with their sexual urges? And that's really where we talk about displacement, another defense mechanism of the unconscious. And displacement is satisfying an impulse or aggression with a substitute object. An example would be someone who is frustrated by his or her boss at work may go home and kick the dog. We see this play out with both characters. So Thomas Ephraim, the character played by Robert Pattinson, we see that he is so angry and has a lot of hostility towards his superior, played by Willem Dafoe, that he takes it out on a seagull. And on the last day that they're on the island, a seagull that he believes is just sort of has it out for him, he grabs him and he beats him mercilessly in one extended shot to basically, he pulverizes the seabird, and in a lot of ways, he's really, that's an aggression, that's an expression of his frustration about everything about working at the lighthouse. Now, you also see this with the Willem Dafoe character, Thomas Wake, in that he is so controlling and so domineering that he goes to Ephraim and he makes him wash the floor again. Even though he just washed it and he can find nothing wrong with it, it's about him exerting his dominance and him doing what he says. And there is a lot of sexual expression through dominance and submission in this movie. It's all about possessiveness and control. So the head lighthouse keeper, played by Willem Dafoe, he will not allow Robert Pattinson up into the lighthouse. He gives him all these other subordinate and what we might call secondary or feminine roles in the film. So he's asserting his masculine dominance over his subordinate in a way that in this period of time you may expect, not just with a working superior hierarchical relationship, but even in that period of time, what a traditional Judeo-Christian marriage was often like was that the man was the head of the household, and a wife was very subservient, and her role was to be submissive, obedient, and compliant to her husband. And you see Willem Dafoe's character kind of play this out with Ephraim. It's this control and this dominance that the more and more that Ephraim is put in that position of submissiveness, he can't handle it. He feels like that he's being condescended to the point when the roles are turned towards the end of the movie and everything's gone batshit crazy, that Ephraim puts his superior in a dog collar and makes him walk around on all fours on a leash, because now he's gonna exert dominance and control over his submissive boss to the point where he makes him go into his own grave, and then he buries him alive. So there's a lot of sexual repression in terms of control and dominance in their relationship together. And so there's a lot of heavy sexual imagery in this film, but there's also about the concept of isolation and disconnect, because we see that over time these two men, when they're apart from society, when their function is just between each other, and they're not the most stable people to begin with, and you see how that warps their perception and confirmation bias and what they overlook and what they become very obsessed about. You see how they take things out on each other in certain ways, that isolation and disconnect makes them turn to each other both for companionship and affection, but they're at war with that power and control. And so it's really the social lubricant of alcohol that helps disarm them, to where with isolation and disconnect, they look to each other for human touch and for connection, to where they are dancing slow dances with each other in a way that you would expect a romantic couple to do so. I don't think this movie has any subliminal homoerotic or homosexual messaging. I think simply that when men or anybody is in isolation and disconnected, that they will turn to other people or things for some type of connection, some type of longing and yearning. And so even though they turn to one another in moments, they still have this very hostile relationship towards each other. You see the Robert Pattinson with the character with the isolation and the disconnect, that he takes that mermaid figurine and he brings it to life, to where not only does he start out just masturbating to that object, but then he starts to have these dreams and these images and experiences of having actual sexual intercourse with a real-life mermaid. It's never made clear to me how much there's a real, authentic mermaid that visits the island, or again, that's him projecting from his isolation and disconnect. There is some symbolism and there's some imagery that suggests that the lighthouse, the light, creates or contributes some type of emotional or sexual expression, to where Willem Dafoe's character, Thomas Wake, you see him stripping naked and being up at the top of the lighthouse with the light. We see that there's tentacles up there that might be a larger sea creature. But again, with this disconnect, they're looking for other people or things to feel something. And again, going back to Dr. Penis again, it all seems to be about Freudian sexual repression. But then the whole movie kind of takes a little bit of a turn when we wonder, like, how much of this is real and how much of this is symbolic or suggestive or hallucinatory. And after you see all these really weird things, you realize that it was the Willem Dafoe character that introduced these concepts throughout the film. And so I want to explore this idea of brainwashing, or the psychology of indoctrination, or subliminal suggestions, because all of these things that happen to the Robert Pattinson character, his previous associate went insane, that there was a storm that left them stranded, that it's bad luck if you do anything to a seafaring bird or a sea animal. All these things happen, and then we see the negative consequences of that. And you start to question how much of this is real, or has the Willem Dafoe character, has Thomas Wake been subtly suggesting these things into an unstable Ephraim Winslow, that now he's starting to see things because he's been sort of indoctrinated, or there's been an inception that he's looking for these things to kind of mix with his unstable, unhealthy mind. When you look at all the things we know about brainwashing and indoctrination, whether it be cults or just super religious communities, that there oftentimes is, number one, isolating somebody, which these characters are, and then two, a lot of times it's suggestive and it's subtle. It's not very defiant and combative. It's really about helping them see things in a manner that they own their own thoughts and feelings, or that they projected onto this new way of thinking and worldview. So it makes us wonder, did this all really happen, or is it more of an extension of Winslow's paranoia, hallucinations? Was it suggested by the Thomas Wake character to exert control and dominance over him, maybe in the same way that he did with his previous associate? So that instead of looking at Winslow as the character that's kind of gone crazy and mad, which happens at the end, is it really Thomas Wake's character who really is the malicious, conniving, evil character that brings about all of this destruction and dysfunction into the relationship? Even though, like most Greek mythologies and morality tales, in the end, they both get their just deserve, which we see that is a very graphic and unhappy ending to both of them. But I'm really curious to hear what you guys think about The Lighthouse. You're welcome to share your interpretation of the ending, but I'm more curious about the psychological and the sexual symbolism that happens. Who do you view as the protagonist and the antagonist of this film? Be sure to leave me your comments and remarks. Tell me how this movie was a mind to you as well. You're also welcome to leave recommendations of films and other television shows that you would like for me to tackle here on Psych Cinema. The reason I'm doing The Lighthouse is because so many of you wanted to hear my own thoughts, and thank you very much for making me watch this film. No, it's very rewarding and rich, but man, I get why you wanted to extend the conversation about this movie. There's so many ways to dissect it and to explore what its meaning is, if there's any meaning at all. Well, that's going to do it for this episode of Psych Cinema. Thank you for watching. I'm Jonathan Hetterly. Until next time, I'll see you at the movies.